Narayana namaskrityam naram chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayam mudirayet. Om namo bhagavate vasudevaya. Om namo bhagavate vasudevaya. Om namo bhagavate vasudevaya. So, Hare Krishna. So, we haven't met for a couple of weeks, so it might be useful for us to touch upon what we have learned in the second canto because that's foundational for rest of the discussion. Today we will be starting the third canto. However, we would want to draw upon the core principles that we ingrained from the second canto, and then keeping that foundation in mind or keeping that perspective, we should view every verse that we're going to come in touch with. The journey of Srimad Bhagavatam is extraordinarily exciting, and it's exciting because it allows you to unfold spiritually as a soul as we proceed from the first canto onwards towards the last verse in the 12th canto. So we practically unfold along with Shastra because it's dynamic. And when scripture is dynamic, it means that it's personified. Srimad Bhagavatam is Krishna's personification. There's no difference between Srimad Bhagavatam and Krishna. And as a consequence, when you very prayerfully come in touch with Srimad Bhagavatam, then it allows you to unfold along with the further details that are being shared. So each and every canto has details and it lays a different layer of foundation of understanding. When we use the word foundation of understanding, we are referring to Sambandha. Sambandha primarily is the core principle because without knowing who we are and without knowing who Krishna is, there is no question of us being able to love him. There's no question of us being able to surrender to him. And without loving him and without surrendering to him, one cannot render proper service. Abhideya comes after one is able to fall in love with Krishna, and also after falling in love, being able to surrender fully. So there is a sequence. So Sambandha, which is practically the relationship between us and Krishna, the knowledge of Sambandha Gyan becomes extraordinarily powerful in us being able to actually know the beloved and also to be able to surrender and to render service. And Srimad Bhagavatam is one of the forms of Krishna that allows us to, or rather facilitates this process of Sambandha Gyan. So we have the coming in touch with those who have already received knowledge of Sambandha from the Lord, in which case they're already in touch with the eternal relationship. They have the ability to offer Sambandha to us because they have the ability to give that level of experience and faith through their interactions with us at different levels. So that's why Srimad Bhagavad Gita starts with Pranipatena Pariprashnena Sevaya. That's the only means for us to be able to move forward. There really isn't any other way for us to move forward because we need to receive the Sambandha Gyan from one who has already received it. So Sadhu Sangha becomes extraordinarily powerful because it allows us to serve the Sadhu. And by serving the Sadhu, we also develop the ability, or rather, we receive mercy because in the heart of the Sadhu is Bhakti Devi. Krishna doesn't have bhakti in one sense, you see. He had to come down as a devotee, as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He had to come down in the mood of Srimati Radharani. That's when he had the maximum abundance of bhakti to distribute. So he comes as Srimati Radharani because she has the maximum abundance of love for Krishna. If you are in search of Krishna Prema, who has the maximum of Krishna Prema? It is Srimati Radharani. As a consequence, we basically receive Prema, we receive Bhakti, we receive faith from those who already have it. They are supposed to give it to us. That is the chain. And as a consequence, the chain itself needs to be served. So we represent, whoever represents that particular chain, we serve them. Pranipatena Pariprashnena Sevaya. And then Bhakti Devi, on her own accord, she becomes very pleased because we are serving those who have bhakti in their hearts. and she comes from them to our hearts because they look upon us with mercy. And as a consequence, the journey begins for us when we come in touch with those who already have Bhakti Devi in the heart, which is the reason why the first aparad amongst the 10 offenses to the holy names is Vaishnava aparad, because the Vaishnava, the sadhu, is one who has bhakti in their heart. He is the source, or she is the source of the journey. He or she is the source of the journey because they carry this faith and they carry their experiences, they carry sambandha, and then by service, bhakti passes on to us. So Krishna does not control this process. Krishna doesn't control this process. This is the conclusion of our acharyas. Krishna basically resides, or bhakti, the quality of relationship between the devotee and Krishna, resides in the heart of his devotees. And the devotees control bhakti because they practically feel merciful. And they say that, this devotee is wonderful, this devotee is simple, this soul needs help. And then they ask for help. And then Bhakti Devi descends from their heart and then facilitates the connection that we have with ourselves and Krishna. So there's a very, very powerful principle because it's very simple, it's accessible, and it's also very practical because you come in touch with those who already have things. It's just a very natural way to receive. So the point is, sadhu sangha is one of the ways where we come in touch with Krishna, because in the sadhu's heart there is sambandha gyan, and sambandha gyan can be passed on when the sadhu desires to pass on the blessing. This is seen with the interaction of Sri Narad Muni with the transcendentalists who visited the ashram where his mother was a maidservant. So it was not a very significant birth in terms of qualification, in terms of birth. There was no economic opulence. She was a maidservant, so there wasn't really great access to gurus, etc., in terms of tutelage and being able to receive facilities for further scriptural education. But the beauty was that there was Sukriti. As a consequence, she was a part of an ashram where transcendentalists used to visit during Chaturmasya. Chaturmasya, the 4 months, they travel around and it's a practical requirement. They assemble in an ashram because it's the monsoon season. So you can't really move from one place to another in pilgrimage, or you can't really move from one place to another. So the commuting is quite restricted because of monsoon, because most of the commuting was done by foot and by road. So Chaturmasya, they used to gather and they used to share katha. So during one such opportunity, Sri Narad Muni, out of the simplicity of his heart, because he was a child, and children are very simple, it's wonderful to learn from them. He was wanting to serve, and he basically very simply was rendering menial service because his mother was situated there. And then because of this menial service, there was mercy that was passed on. There was sambandha gyan that was passed on from the transcendentalists who were visiting the ashram onto the heart of Sri Narad Muni. And then the subsequent birth, he becomes Sri Narad Muni. Now, when did he become Sri Narad Muni? That is not consequential, because once one becomes an eternal aspect of Krishna's existence, it doesn't matter as to when they began, because they are eternal. They are a part of the eternal, what we would call as the opulence or the eternal entourage of Krishna. They are a part of the eternal journey. So it doesn't really matter as to when it happened and how it happened and what was the issue, the history. The point we want to make here is sadhus have the ability to give sambandha gyan, and seva is a very simple aspect. And seva is also wonderful because it allows us to humble ourselves. And when you catch a broom, when you sweep the temple, when you sweep, the kshetra wherever the Lord's services are, when you clean up using a mop, then regardless of your qualification, regardless of the profession, then automatically all we are doing is serving, because it's so simple. It's very simple. You can't be anything else when you're holding a mop. You cannot be anything else when you're holding a broom. You can only be a servant, and that is exactly what you need to be. And as a consequence, menial service plays a very big role because it cleanses the dust from our heart. It gives us an opportunity to be humble as in wanting and accepting our circumstances and wanting and accepting instructions. Pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya requires the acceptance of authority. Most people who stumble on the path of spiritual life have issues with authority. They can't accept authority and they commit offenses because they don't have the ability. And this is not an issue of not knowing. It is simply an issue of how some people come through because they've offended some other aspect of Krishna's arrangement in the past. So there is some kind of an offense that is carried over, and that offense manifests itself in terms of bad behavior. Once an offense is committed towards a sadhu, one should realize that the offender does not have any immunity. There is no question of immunity, which essentially means that by the time it ever gets to the point where someone is offended, then one should already understand that there was no immunity to begin with. If there was immunity, then the super soul within the heart would have somehow or the other showed some restraint. If there was a blessing or a sukriti from the past where this would have prevented it, then there would have definitely been an issue where there would have probably been some kind of a tug in the heart saying, "Don't do it." You see, don't do this. Don't speak in this way. Don't act in this way because you could be offending the devotee who is in front of you. So this particular issue of offense, once it happens, it essentially is also a qualification or understanding to we should be very clear that the immunity has already been taken away. Yeah, the person has already lost their immunity, which means that there was some layer of protection which prevented the person from going into the next step of committing, verbally speaking things and acting in a certain way, and that has been stripped away. It's been taken away because they've done something else. So one needs to understand that when you approach devotees and when you are speaking, please understand that it is their heart which is a storehouse of bhakti. And if you have received bhakti and if you want to keep bhakti, then we want to acknowledge that we do not want to ever offend the source of bhakti, because then it becomes a problem. Do the Vaishnavas take offense? Do they get offended? The answer is no. The Vaishnavas, the gurus, never get offended. Srila Prabhupada, and I've heard this from other spiritual masters personally, and they always say that they treat us like children. Children, or rather babies, who come in touch with us and they pass stool, they pass urine, and they are babies, you see. And this is the attitude of the spiritual master towards the disciple. The spiritual master looks upon the disciple. All Vaishnavas look upon others. They never take offense. The issue is not so much the Vaishnava taking offense, it's Bhakti Devi herself. She is very sensitive to it. And the Vaishnava is very dear to people in the spiritual sky, more dear than they are to those who are terrestrial, who are on this planet. And as a consequence, the offense basically becomes an issue with others whom the Vaishnava is connected to eternally. So this is the issue. It's like someone becoming upset because you're close to them, and then someone tells you something, and just it becomes balloons into a problem. So the point I'm trying to emphasize is that one of the sources of Krishna's Sambandha Gyan is the sadhu. The next source of Sambandha Gyan is Harinam. One's chanting of Harinam, calling upon Krishna's names, allows one to unfold Nama, Rupa, Guna, Leela. Nama, Rupa, Guna, Leela. Everything becomes revealed through Harinam. And as a consequence, one receives inspiration from the sadhu, which is mercy to chant, because one requires faith, an abundance of faith. When the faith is received from the sadhu, then they have the ability to chant. And then once they start chanting, then what does happen is that they also receive and come in touch with Krishna. Nama naminoho abhinnatvam. There is no difference between him and his name. There's again an opportunity to come close to Sambandha. And the third opportunity to come close to Sambandha is the personification of Krishna, which is Srimad Bhagavatam, the literary personification. Imagine that you are in touch with a scripture that's been authored by Lord Narayan. Yeah. These are the realizations of personalities who are Krishna and his very personal servants. Krishna himself descends as Vyasa, Lord Vyasadeva. These are the collection of realizations of the personal entourage of Krishna. You can imagine how confidential this is. We minimize what's available to us we minimize what's available to us simply because of the fact that it's available so easily. In reality, 200 years back, or even 100 years back, during Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur's time, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur had to find a source of Srimad Bhagavatam. He practically had to source a physical copy because physical copies were extraordinarily rare because everything was authored by hand. So one Gurukul would have one Srimad Bhagavatam. As a consequence, if you want to study Srimad Bhagavatam, you'll have to become the servant of the Guru who is basically teaching Srimad Bhagavatam in the Gurukul, in the ashram. So it was very rare, and as a consequence, it was appreciated. Now we have access. So much mercy has been given because our nature is also very difficult. In other words, we are in a circumstance that's quite complex, and we also are quite complex because there's very little that we can offer or call ourselves being qualified to receive what's been given. As a consequence, so much has been given because it's been made accessible to us. Yeah, it's been made accessible, and because it's been made accessible, then we have the ability to come in touch with it. And this is the personification of Krishna, and this is nothing but mercy. There's nothing but mercy. It's just incredible as the amount of sources that are available now. Now, the fourth source of Krishna coming in touch with the personification of the Lord is the Archa Vigraha. The Archa Vigraha of the Lord is non-different from the Lord, and the Archa Vigraha being non-different from the Lord is one of the greatest inspirations and the source of Sambandha Gyan. So in the previous times, when there was initiation, second initiation specifically, the Guru used to offer deities to the devotees who are initiated. And along with the offer of the deity, the Guru would have worshipped the deity. The Sambandha of the Guru with the deity would be passed on to whoever is receiving the deity. So it was a very, very special way of practically taking someone's hand and placing their hand on Krishna's hands, literally. So it was just very powerful, extraordinarily powerful. Now, the fifth aspect of Krishna Sambandha is the Dham. And Srila Prabhupada writes in the Srimad Bhagavatam, even being in Sri Vrindavan Dham, Sri Mayapur, Mathura Mandal, and Jagannath Puri, if one starts even visualizing and wanting to basically come in touch with the Lord in Vrindavan, that is equal to actually coming in touch with the Lord. And the reason Srila Prabhupada explains it is that just thinking of the Lord is not different from actually the event happening, in the sense that there is no difference between a thought versus the physical reality, because there isn't any difference. All of these are on the absolute platform, and because they're on the absolute platform, there really isn't much of a distinction either way. So it's very, very powerful when you start thinking about the fact that there is such an opportunity. In Sri Vrindavan and Mayapur, Lord Nityananda explains this very nicely to Srila Jiva Goswami. He says that there is a material layer, and then there is the spiritual sky. The spiritual sky is already here in Vrindavan and Mayapur, and the material layer that covers the spiritual sky is very thin. So if you choose to come and become a part of the material layer, then you experience the material layer. So you can see that in Vrindavan. So you have people coming here for various things. They get bewildered, and then they look around, and then they go back and they start complaining about how filthy the place is. In certain ways, they get very disturbed. And as much as it is true that there are sewers and so on and so forth, it is not materially, I would say, kept or maintained in a wonderful way. However, what is important is for us to understand that regardless of how it is being maintained, when you come in touch with Sri Vrindavan Dham, and when there's a deep desire to wanting to basically come in touch with Krishna's eternal pastimes, then what does happen is that the thin material layer disappears. Because the layer is so thin, one gets the opportunity to come in touch with Krishna's eternal pastimes quite easily if they have the qualifications to do so. So if they're chanting and everything else is wonderful, then they have the ability to come in touch with spiritual reality in a very powerful way, when they are in Vrindavan and Mayapur, Jagannath Puri, etc. Because this is very powerful, because the material layer is very thin. So now 5 different aspects of gaining Sambandha. And Sambandha becomes very important because Krishna says this in the second canto. I want to summarize this, that there are 4 different verses which talk about the Chatushloki, which is the most important aspects of Krishna's teachings there in the to Lord Brahma, to Lord Narayan's teachings to Lord Brahma. There are 4 different aspects. And the 4 different, I would say, verses basically culminate in the 4th verse, where the Srimad Bhagavatam says that if you want to pursue the absolute truth, then you will have to do it in a manner which includes the previous 3 conclusions. So when we start referring to the absolute truth, we are referring to Ananda. Yeah? Ananda, because Ananda, which is the pursuit of pleasure, which is the nature of the soul, the maximum level of pleasure available to the soul is in coming in touch and serving Krishna in complete knowledge. So, unless there is complete knowledge of Sambandha, and then the relationship is with someone who is eternal, the soul will never feel Ananda, which is the absolute truth. As a consequence, the Chatushloki talks about the fact that the ingredients for a spiritual experience have to have the understanding of coming in touch with the Lord, who is in the beginning, who is in the middle, who is in the end. Practically, He is the origin, He is the middle, He is the end. Coming in touch with Him and engaging in activity in such a manner that basically, He also says in the second verse that if there is activity which is not connected to me, then know that it is an illusion. So there has to be activity. And what does it mean? How can you ensure that you're engaging in activity connected to the Lord? The way you ensure that is by increasing your sambandha. If one has the sambandha, that they are the mother or the father of a child, then when they are interacting with the child, they don't need to be reminded of who they are. So the activity will be that of a parent. In a similar vein, when one has deeper sambandha, then their actions on this planet would reflect that. They would constantly be aware and cognizant of the sambandha, and as a consequence, they will move forward with that. So the Lord is talking about sambandha gyan in the second verse, and he's also talking about chit. The first verse is about sat, the second is about chit, and the third is about being completely transcendental, even though being in this world. Prema Bhakti, Bhava Bhaktas, they are fully aware of their eternal spiritual existence whilst being in this body. And as a consequence, when they are in Prema, they are not in this body from a consciousness perspective. They're interacting with the spiritual sky, with the Lord and His entourage, engaging in various services. So, in other words, one can be in this body and not be affected by it, just as much as the super soul is in the body and is not affected by it. Yeah. So that is the third verse. Now we also talk about the 10 different topics of Srimad Bhagavatam. So Srila Sukadev Goswami talks about it in the second canto. Second canto. Yes, the last chapter. The creation of the universe, sub-creation, planetary systems, protection by the Lord, the creative impetus, the change of Manus, the science of God, returning home back to Godhead, liberation, and the summum bonum. So these are 10 different topics of Srimad Bhagavatam, which are going to be interspersed in our discussion as we go along. Yeah, it is going to be interspersed. It is basically going to come along as we read into it. It is going to basically, we're going to experience it at different levels. Yeah. So let us go into the third canto. We wanted to briefly touch upon the second canto to help us understand that the second canto's Chatushloki and the subsequent topic is basically the foundation, the process. It is basically the index, I would say, the window through which we need to view rest of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And as we view the Bhagavatam, keeping this in mind, then we can ask ourselves in terms of, the aspects of various topics that have been discussed in Srimad Bhagavatam, and we can also basically come and have a deeper understanding of the Chatushloki as spoken there. Now, the third canto itself is an extraordinarily interesting canto as we go along. Now, the third canto starts with a conversation between Sri Vidura and Maitreya Rishi. Now, there are three different conversations. The first conversation is Vidura and Maitreya Rishi. This is being spoken about by Sukadev Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj. So that is second conversation. Then Sutta Goswami, who was in the audience with Sukadev Goswami, he is asked to speak about it by Shaunaka Rishi. So there is a conversation between Shaunaka Rishi and Sutta Goswami. This is happening in Naimisharanya. There's a conversation between Sukadev Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj. This is being accounted for by Srila Sutta Goswami. And Sukadev Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj are talking about Vidura and Maitreya Rishi. So we need to understand that it's all very nested. So we need to understand that these are multiple conversations. Now, we spoke early on in today's discussion about being associated with devotees. We also spoke early on today about being associated with devotees and also committing offenses. Now, this entire chapter is about the destruction that is being caused by coming in touch with devotees who carry Krishna in their heart, but due to bad behavior. Yeah, the Kauravas basically are destroyed, as being accounted for in this chapter, by the ill treatment which they meted out to Yudhishthira and the other Pandavas. They were envious. And what does envy? Envy means they don't want them to exist. That's the danger. Envy is the quality of a snake. You see, a venomous serpent does not distinguish a 3-year-old, does not distinguish a saintly person. It does not distinguish someone with a stick who wants to kill the serpent. The venomous snake, it cannot distinguish because it's filled with envy. And it just strikes out, wanting to destroy, saying, I don't want you to exist because I somehow or the other feel threatened by you. So it cannot distinguish. So this enviousness of the Kauravas towards the Pandavas, it was expressed in so many different ways. And the enviousness was expressed in so many different ways in such negative, such a negative manner that it practically dissolved even the Sukriti of Sri Vidura. Unbelievable. Vidura, who is an exalted soul, who had such Sukriti that he could feed Krishna from with his own hands. He was so dear to Krishna, and he was exalted because he was Dharmaraj himself. He was Yamaraj himself. You see, so he was a Mahajan. He had come there and he was completely filled with transcendental knowledge. But associating with the Kauravas, being in the company of all the politically minded, venomous Kauravas, practically dissolved the Sukriti of Vidura. And as a consequence, Sri Vidura, it is said, he left on a pilgrimage so that he could fill his coffers again. When I use the word fill his coffers, I'm referring to regaining the blessings that he had lost by coming in touch with envious people. Yeah. So this is the reason why it's advised that when you come in touch with offenders, walk out of the room, because we will lose our ability to have Krishna and interact with Krishna and being able to serve him. Yeah. We should walk out of the room. This is the reason, because also you see here that the great personality Vidura, for all his accomplishments, and he carried, I would say, an abundance of Sukriti to such an extent that his father was Srila Vyasadeva. He was born in a family of kings. He was wonderfully situated because his mother was a dasi, which essentially means that there was no social standing. So even though he was born in a royal household and he had all the paraphernalia and all the facilities of a royal household, there was this factor of being born to a woman who served as a dasi, as a maidservant, who had no social standing of the kings, because of which Sri Vidura had no issues with humility. Sometimes it works wonderfully because you're born without facilities, but you have all facilities, and it just works so wonderfully in the service of Krishna, because Sri Vidura always reminded himself that he was a Dasi Putra. He was very prudent and he was very cognizant of the fact that his mother was a Dasi. She was basically a maidservant. She was basically, I would use the word slave, who had there was really no, future, or there was no standing. There was no social standing. You belong to someone like cattle, you see. Very unfortunate, but that's the case. So she was a slave, Dasi, and he was born to a Dasi, but he was fathered by Vyasadeva, and he was born in an extraordinarily opulent royal household where he had the ability, or rather, his wisdom was used by the Kauravas to govern. So he was the chief minister. You see? So this is very extraordinary. But with all the chief minister position and the big palace and the mansions and all the paraphernalia, there was this particular stigma of being born to a maidservant, which practically allowed him to remind himself day in and day out that that's what I am. Because everybody else, regardless of what they will see, externally, they will also remember this. So I need to know how to behave in front of others. So he was constantly aware of his position, of his mother being a maidservant with no standing. And as a consequence, he was very humble. So it worked out beautifully. It worked out beautifully in favor of devotional service because he was able to accept it. He was able to accept everything. He was able to basically accept the environment. He was able to accept the situation. All of these he was able to just accept it. So the point we are trying to make here is that this Vidura, who was so fortunate, who was an incarnation of Dharmaraj, he was the potency of Dharmaraj himself, Yamaraj himself. He was a Mahajan. No one knows things better than him. So, Niti, so many different things. He knew things in a very extraordinary way. This was Dharmaraj himself. He felt that his storehouse of piety had left him. Why? Because he was associating with offenders. What were the offenses? The offenses were committed towards Yudhishthira and the other Pandavas. Offenses were committed to Draupadi, and the offenses were also committed towards in the sense, in terms of the extraordinary envy of wanting to kill all of them. So being a part of that and eating on being compensated by such an offensive arrangement, Sri Vidura felt that his piety had to be replenished. And as a consequence, he just left. He left on a pilgrimage, and he basically wanted to go to different parts of the Bharatvarsha to receive blessings from the sadhus in places of pilgrimage, because he felt that all the blessings that he had already been taken away by coming in touch with the Kauravas, who were extraordinarily offensive to the Vaishnavas, to the Pandavas, and to Draupadi. So this chapter has so many different angles. It has angles about the position of a great personality. It has angles about the extraordinary circumstances which devotees go through, very extraordinary circumstances. Yeah. The Pandavas, being devotees of the Lord, were poisoned. Draupadi was humiliated. They lost their belongings several times. When I use the word belongings, I'm talking about a kingdom. And then they lost their children. It's just extraordinary. The amount of challenges they went through were just extraordinary. And then there was the circumstance of Vidura, who was very cognizant of everything, and at the same time, he couldn't prevent it. And there was also Vidura wanting to just walk away from all of this to different places of pilgrimage, because he felt that his storehouse of piety was depleted. It was just basically depleted. It was just completely gone. It is the truth. Before death comes on to the Kauravas, they had lost all their immunity. They had lost all their sukriti. They had lost everything. And as a consequence, all kinds of decision making became very flawed. Decision making requires blessings. Without blessings, one cannot make proper decisions. Without proper decisions, one really does not know what kind of a future they would create for themselves. And as a consequence, one should understand that this idea of what we would call as wanting to create a future for ourselves and with right decisions, etc., it requires piety, it requires devotional service. And as a consequence, you automatically are given the right direction by the super soul. What to do and what not to do becomes quite evident to one who is in touch with spiritual reality. And this spiritual reality becomes completely obfuscated. People become confused. We see it again and again in even all our temples. We see it at different interactions. that you will find that very bad decisions can be taken, even by those who are considered to be extraordinarily knowledgeable. And the reason this happens is because there is a block. It occurs. The blocks occur because there are offenses. And when the offenses occur, then the intelligence is lost. We don't have the ability to take proper decisions in life. And we notice this in the Mahabharata. Srila Jiva Goswami considers the Mahabharata as the essence of the Vedas. And it is the truth because it's a personification, or rather an extraordinary journey of explaining the entire life of a soul, and bad decisions, good decisions, piety, impiety, all kinds of circumstances are being covered in the Mahabharata, including the helpless nature of a soul when captured by time. The time factor is so powerful, Kala is so powerful, that there's extraordinarily powerful, what we would call as the heritage of the Kuru family. They all got destroyed because of offenses. Because of offenses, they lost immunity, they had no ability to think, and then one thing led to the other, and then there was complete destruction because they had no ability to even think. So it is said the lifespan or the longevity of the Kauravas was automatically reduced to almost nothing when they disrobed Draupadi. The disrobing of Draupadi was such a powerful and I would say destructive force that began there, that it practically robbed the entire Kaurava army, including their generals, who were all very accomplished, of their ability to fight. It is said that it was not Arjuna's skills. There were many factors. There were many skilled warriors on the Kaurava side. Bhishmadev, Dronacharya, Kripacharya, these are all very accomplished archers with great knowledge, with mystic powers. Karna, these are all very great warriors. Why did they lose? They lost because they lost the Sukruti. They had no ability to win because of the fact that their longevity was just reduced to nothing when Draupadi was disrobed and they were a part of that assembly. Because Sri Vidura was a part of that assembly, he felt that his piety was lost as well. And Srila Prabhupada concurs that it is the truth. Our acharyas concur that when you are a part of an assembly where there are offenses, then our own spiritual life can come into peril. Yeah, our own spiritual life can come into peril because we practically are in touch with a situation that where you have to walk away. If you can't correct it, you have to walk away. Because if you don't do that, then a lot of things just get depleted. So there's so much struggle. Yeah, there's so much struggle after that. So this particular chapter, as simple as it may be in terms of Vidura's journey, is quite complex in touching upon all kinds of dimensions. So we'll start with the verses. I'll read the English so we could save some time. I'm now on chapter 1 of Canto 3. First verse. Sukadev Goswami said, after renouncing his prosperous home and entering the forest, King Vidura, the great devotee, asked this question of His Grace Maitreya Rishi. What else is there to say about the residential house of the Pandavas? Sri Krishna, the Lord of everything, acted as your minister. He used to enter that house as if it were his own, and he did not take any care of Duryodhana's house. Yeah? This is a glorification of the house of Pandavas, where Krishna practically considered it his own home. It's almost incredible. It's unimaginable for us to even think of that they had such personal, intimate association with the Lord. And even though there was such personal, intimate association, imagine that there were quite a few people, most of them, many of them, in the assembly of the Kurus, who simply did not even give that place or standing to Krishna. They never even recognized him as the Lord. So even if he comes before some people, they don't have the Sukruti to even recognize him as the Lord himself. So it's very unfortunate. So you see the fortunate side and the unfortunate side as well. The king asked Sukadev Goswami, where and when did the meeting and discussion take place between Saint Vidura and His Grace Maitreya Muni? Kindly oblige, my lord, and describe this to us. Saint Vidura was a great and pure devotee of the Lord, and therefore his questions to His Grace Rishi Maitreya must have been very purposeful. on the highest level and approved by learned circles. It is said that not everybody is respected based on age. The Shudras respect one another based on age. If someone is older in Shudra society, they are to be respected. So, regardless of whether they're knowledgeable, regardless of whether they have accomplishments, regardless of whether they are wealthy, etc., if someone is older, they have to be respected because Shudras basically recognize authority based on age. Older is better. Yeah. Sometimes we see caricatures of God with a white beard. Those caricatures of God, I would say not a caricature, imagination, I would say, is because society is a Shudra society. So they have a tendency to think that if someone is God, he must be very old and he must have a white beard. Yeah. So this is Shudra society's imagination of authority. Now, Vaishyas, you can't really expect any respect from a Vaishya, a businessman, unless you are a good businessman yourself. So unless you are a good businessman and you have more wealth or have some very nice way of making money, the businessman is not going to respect us because the standard of respect for a businessman is money. He doesn't care about age. If he finds that 20-year-old has some very good techniques, he will be lauded and he will be given accolades and he would be made to sit on top of, the entire, what I would call as um, uh, uh, the board or whatever it is, considered to be authority in the corporate sector. And the reason is that if you have the ability to excel in what they would consider as precious, then you ought to be respected. So they don't care about age. They don't respect age. They respect money because money is their focus. The Kshatriyas, they have a focus on strength and the ability and the perseverance to use that strength to enforce dharma. So for a Kshatriya to receive respect and to give respect, they need to be able to overpower the others. So they can't really respect age, they can't respect money. You need to have strength and you need to also have the ability or the internal strength, mental strength to be able to carry out your dharma. Yeah, Kshatriyas respect perseverance. Perseverance is very much respected by Kshatriyas. Great determination to follow through with principles. Great determination to enforce dharma. This is follow through. Yeah, by the Kshatriyas. Lastly, the Brahmanas. Brahmanical society. Srila Sukadev Goswami was 16 years old. All these sages who had gathered around to listen to him were much, much older. In Brahmanical society, age has no consequence. Money has no consequence. Srila Sukadev Goswami was practically clad with nothing, Digambara. Yeah? There was nothing covering his very young 16-year-old body, nothing at all. So they don't care about age, they don't care about opulences, neither do they care about strength. Brahmanical society, if you want to earn respect, you have to display a superior understanding of sublime scripture. If you don't have the ability to talk about sublime truth, if you don't have wisdom, then Brahmanical society, they won't respect us. It doesn't matter. A money person can, they may be useful in terms of resources. Someone could be useful in terms of enforcing ideas, but then the Brahmanas don't respect based on age, wealth, or power. They don't. They basically focus on now knowledge, transcendental knowledge, realizations. So in that sense, now when we talk about the exchange between Srila Sri Vidura, who was Srila Vyasadev's progeny, he was considered to be the most wise of his times. He was an incarnation of the Mahajan Yamaraj. He was also basically a very, very dear devotee of Krishna. All of these qualifies him and his conversation as being worthy of hearing. Then Maitreya Rishi was also a very accomplished personality, extraordinarily accomplished sage. And as a consequence, these are two different people who are of great accomplishment, and their ability to digest and bring forth realizations and share sublime truth and being in touch with spiritual reality was so high that that conversation becomes very valued. Yeah. So here they were all very eager that these two personalities, when they come together, What were they talking about? On one hand, you had Sri Vidura, who was a pure devotee of the Lord, and the other, His Grace Maitreya Rishi, who was also a great devotee, but also very accomplished in terms of his transcendental nature and his attributes. Both of these were seen. So, because the Brahmanas respect this kind of an exchange, they were very eager to hear. So, in the previous canto, towards the end, you can see the eagerness of Shaunaka Rishi in wanting Srila Sutta Goswami to share this exchange. They're very eager. What happened? What was spoken of? Because they were Brahmanical, they're interested in transcendental knowledge. They're interested in sublime truth. They're interested in digesting and able to bring out the gems of realizations. And when two people who are very accomplished sit together, then everybody is interested in knowing what they spoke of. Text 5. Sri Sutta Goswami said, the great sage Sukadev Goswami was highly experienced and was pleased with the king. Thus being questioned by the king, he said to him, please hear the topics attentively. Now, the second pair, there's Vidura and Maitreya Rishi, very qualified. Now, Srila Sukadev Goswami and Parikshit Maharaj, very qualified. Yeah. So now you have a second conversation of two very qualified people. Srila Sukadev Goswami said, King Dhritarashtra became blind under the influence of impious desires to nourish his dishonest sons, and thus he set fire to the lacquer house to burn his fatherless nephews, the Pandavas. So this is basically Dhritarashtra, his impious desires to nourish his dishonest sons. It was basically impious. So this was not a Kshatriya. This was basically a Shudra, impious desires. Someone who was in the garb of a Kshatriya, but with Shudra desires, impious desires that were more based on the body, less based on the well-being of his subjects, less based on the well-being of the whole world and the creation, or less cognizant of what is expected of him by the Lord. These are all impious natures. The king did not forbid his son Dushasana's abominable action of grabbing the hair of Draupadi, the wife of the godly king Yudhishthira, even though her tears washed the red dust on her breast. Now we see this quite significantly. The Draupadi becoming insulted practically uproots the Kauravas and destroys them to the last person. You see this with the dynasty of Ravana, where every single person was destroyed. Both of the great epics in our Shastra, Ramayana and Sri Mahabharata, both of these touch upon the disgrace and the lust experienced by powerful men, which in turn hurts women. Both of these are based on the disgrace experienced by women. Now, the great power that comes out of a woman who is disgraced, especially if you have a very chaste woman like Mother Draupadi or very chaste woman like Mother Sita, their disgrace and their humiliation and their coming in touch with the lower energies of powerful men, which means practically that the entire destructive power of the universe would begin as a seed right at that point in time. They have the ability to give power to others to destroy those who have shamed them. So Mother Sita's incarceration by Ravana and Mother Sita's ill treatment by Ravana practically became the destructive power that Ravana's dynasty felt. It became the destructive power of Lord Ram's arrows and the army which was led by Lord Ram. Ravana's entire dynasty had lost their longevity because of this offense. They had lost their longevity already. So there was no question of battle strategy. There was no question of any kind of important battle tactics. There was no question of even the greatest of weapons working there on the battlefield, simply because the great power that came, the destructive power. This is basically Shakti, the great power of destruction that comes. That basic destruction came from Mother Sita because of her anger, and from Draupadi because of her anger. In both these cases, the destruction had already begun because it had already robbed the dynasties of their longevity and it had robbed them of their intelligence. So there was really no way they could have won. Regardless of who was in front of them, the death had already been signed on. It is already over. The game is over. Yeah. So now Mother Draupadi's basically the offense committed was not it was not forbidden by the Dhritarashtra. He never prevented Dushasana from acting in the way he did. Yeah, he did not, and that practically is where he sowed the seed of destruction for himself. Yudhishthira, who was born without any enemy, was unfairly defeated in gambling, but because he had taken the vow of truthfulness, he went off to the forest. When he came back in due course and begged the return of his rightful share of the kingdom, he was refused by the Dhritarashtra, who was overwhelmed by illusion. Yeah, this you see this here? This overwhelmed by illusion. This idea of Duryodhana not even wanting to give 5 villages. This is basically the death knell that was sounded by the offense to Draupadi. If they had not done anything to Draupadi, and if there had just been a battle between the Kauravas and the Pandavas, it's a different story. Yeah, it would have probably taken on a different turn. But the moment Draupadi got involved in disrobing and her humiliation, it was over. So even when 5 villages were asked for, Duryodhana and Dhritarashtra did not have the common sense to accept 5 villages, just to give 5 villages. Who would not just give 5 villages and retain a kingdom? Yeah, who would be so senseless of wanting to go into war for just not even giving 5 villages? Yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about, saying there's a loss of intelligence and there's the inability to think, and the powerful force of destruction that comes from that particular act is already taken away the longevity, it has taken away intelligence, everything is already done. The stage is already set. There really wasn't anything else. It was just basically set. Illusion. This is illusion. This is basically what happens. Lord Krishna was sent by Arjuna into the assembly as a spiritual master of the whole world. And although his words were heard by some, like Bhishma, as pure nectar, it was not so for the others who were completely bereft of the last farthing of past pious works. The king, Dhritarashtra or Duryodhana, did not take the words of Lord Krishna very seriously. Yeah, very seriously. No immunity, no protection, because the offense was so great that they could not even process the very basic, aspect of, I would say, politics. Isn't it politics where you basically give away 5 villages and you keep an entire kingdom and you avoid war? This is common sense. Yeah, this is common sense. But here it is. Here it is. It's you once this offense was committed, they can't even go in the direction which most people would just grab because it is the most, I would say, intelligent thing to do. When Vidura was invited by his elder brother, Dhritarashtra, for consultation, he entered the house and gave instructions which were exactly to the point. His advice is well known, and instructions by Vidura are approved by expert ministers of state. Vidura said, "You must now return the legitimate share to Yudhishthira, who has no enemies and who has been forbearing through untold suffering due to your offenses. He is waiting with his younger brothers, amongst whom is the revengeful Bhima. Breathing heavily like a snake, surely you are afraid of him. Lord Krishna, the personality of Godhead, has accepted the sons of Pritha as his kinsmen, and all the kings of the world are with Sri Krishna. He is present in his home with all his family members, the kings and the princes of Yadu dynasty, who have conquered an unlimited number of rulers, and he is their Lord. You are maintaining offense personified Duryodhana as your infallible son, but he is envious of Lord Krishna. And because you are thus maintaining a non-devotee of Krishna, you are devoid of all auspicious qualities. Relieve yourself of this ill fortune as soon as possible and do good to the whole family." Yeah. So this is basically very direct advice, and even this doesn't enter the skull because the offense has been committed. So it's just fascinating to see that even Ravana was advised by even the other demons that this is Lakshmi, you're bringing peril into the kingdom. You basically brought destruction to the doorstep. Go return her. And Lord Rama, he's so soft-hearted and he's so compassionate that he's practically even at the verge or the eve of battle, is giving an opportunity for Ravana to return Mother Sita with dignity. But what is it which prevented Ravana? There was no common sense. There was no common sense at all because it is lost. It has been bereft. It goes away. Yeah. Now Vidura is advising Dhritarashtra. It is falling on deaf ears because the offense is so great that because the offense is so great, nothing is heard properly. One moment, I'm just turning my pages here. Yeah. While speaking thus, Vidura, whose personal character was esteemed by respectable persons, was insulted by Duryodhana, who was swollen with anger and whose lips were trembling. Duryodhana was in company with Karna, his younger brothers, and his maternal uncle Shakuni, who asked him to come here. Who asked him to come here? This son of a kept mistress. He is so crooked that he spies in the interests of the enemy against those on whose support he has grown up. Toss him out of the palace immediately and leave him with only his breath. See, this is great benediction. Sometimes when we find it difficult to leave, Krishna forces us out of certain association. This is a great benediction. Duryodhana, by the effect of time and because of his sinful nature, insults Vidura with such viciousness that Vidura practically has to leave. This is Krishna's arrangement. And the beauty is, Vidura doesn't really accept it as anything but Krishna's arrangement. That we see in the next verse. Thus, being pierced by arrows through his ears and afflicted to the core of his heart, Vidura placed his bow on the door and quit his brother's palace. He was not sorry, for he considered the acts of the external energy to be supreme. Here, this is again very clearly the how a devotee processes actions. We spoke about it in the previous session, the last session. Everything is accepted as the Lord's doing because the Lord is in the beginning, He's in the middle, He's in the end. Everything happens with His complete cognizance. Yeah, the external and the internal potencies, we interact with all of them. So Sri Vidura accepted this insult as nothing but a benediction of the Lord because he understood that this is the external energy. And if Krishna wanted to, he could control it. Yeah. We spoke about it. We spoke about and we gave the example of the Anushtup mantra in the previous class. And we spoke about how each and every akshara of Lord Narasimha's mantra, the Anushtup mantra, the 32 syllable mantra, is associated with the bija that controls a certain potency in material creation. So when one chants Ugram Viram Mahavishnu, one automatically is coming in touch and practically submitting themselves to the Lord, who practically is the master of the Adi Devic potency. And as a consequence, who we are considered Adhyatmic. Then it gives us the ability to control Adi Bhautik, which is the changes that occur around us. Yeah. So it's just fascinating to see how the control process works. The control process is that Krishna is the origin, Lord Narasimha is the origin, Lord Rama is the origin. And as a consequence, everything else, the Devas are servants of the Supreme Lord. And the Devas themselves are our controllers. And we, in turn, are situated within this body. And we basically are controllers of the Adi Bhautik, which is the material elements that surround us. So our ability to move, or rather, the most simplest of activities of moving an eyelash, or, the simplest of activities of digesting and evacuating after digesting on a daily basis, all of this are being controlled at such a minute level by the Adi Devic potency, which is the demigods. And above them is the Supreme Lord Himself. So the Anushtup mantra, as we spoke the previous class, is a breakdown of the Anushtup mantra. Practically, we notice that Ugram Viram Mahavishnum, there are 32 syllables. The 32 syllables are associated with different potencies. So Narasimhadev practically, manifests and controls the Adi Devic, and the Adi Devic control the Adhyatmic and the Adi Bhautik. So in a similar fashion, Sri Vidura, he was not ignorant of this fact. He was completely cognizant of the circumstances of life and how minutely circumstances of life are controlled by Krishna and his servants. As a consequence, when Duryodhana insulted him. He accepted that this is Krishna's arrangement. He left. So Krishna forced Vidura to leave this unwanted company by forcing Duryodhana to insult. By his piety, Vidura achieved the advantages of the pious Kauravas. After leaving Hastinapura, he took shelter of many places of pilgrimages, which are the Lord's lotus feet. With a desire to gain a high order of pious life, he traveled to holy places where thousands of transcendental forms of the Lord are situated. So he visited different yatras, had darshan of different deity forms. All of this was done to regain what he considers as lost piety because of the fact that he was associating with offenders. He began to travel alone, thinking only of Krishna, through various holy places like Ayodhya, Dwaraka, and Mathura. He traveled where the air, hill, orchard, river, and lake are all pure and sinless, and where the forms of the unlimited decorate the temples. Thus, he performed the pilgrim's progress. While so traversing the earth, he simply performed duties to please the Supreme Lord Hari. His occupation was pure and independent. He was constantly sanctified by taking his bath in holy places, although he was in the dress of a mendicant and had no hairdressing nor a bed on which to lie. Thus, he was always unseen by his various relatives. So he was very pure. He simply performed his duties to please the Supreme Lord. See, this is the beauty of parikrama, is that you have nothing else to do. You tend to focus 100% on what is important for pleasing the Lord. So that is being spoken of here, that he was focused completely on the pilgrimage, and as a consequence, he gained a lot. Thus, when he was in the land of Bharatvarsha, traveling to all the places of pilgrimage, he visited Prabhasha Kshetra, and at that time, Maharaj Yudhishthira was the emperor and held the world under one military strength and one flag. At the place of pilgrimage at Prabhasha, it came to his knowledge that all his relatives had died due to violent passion, just as an entire forest burns due to the fire produced by the friction of bamboos. After this, he proceeded west, where river Saraswati flows. So, a forest fire is caused due to the friction between two twigs, which essentially means that it's an act of God, as we would call it. Yeah, it's an act of God where two twigs are basically brushing against each other, and as a consequence, you have a blazing fire that begins. And in a similar fashion, the entire Yadu dynasty and the Kuru dynasty, they all perished. And Vidura heard about it as he was doing his pilgrimage. And he considered it just as much as the work of Kala, where in a forest fire, there is sometimes is not that you don't find a human cause. You find two twigs brushing against each other due to wind, and then the Lord's desire to destroy that particular tract of land, and the fire just begins, and the fire consumes everything. On the bank of river Saraswati, there were 11 places of pilgrimage, namely Trita, Ushana, Manu, Prithu, Agni, Ashita, Vayu, Shurasa, Go, Guha, Shraddha. Vidura visited all of them and duly performed rituals. There were also many other temples of various forms of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Vishnu, established by great sages and demigods. These temples are marked with the chief emblems of the Lord, and they reminded one always of the original personality of Godhead, Lord Krishna. So one of the very interesting discussions that occur further down in the 6th canto is when Mother Ganga is requested by Bhagirath to come down and descend to the planet so that he could wash away the sins of his ancestors. At that time, she also hears from him about how everybody else would take advantage and everybody else could wash away their sinful reactions and become pure. So there is concern by Mother Ganga saying, what will happen if all this sin comes upon me? What should I do? And then Bhagirath, I think there's an exchange which happens then where she is assured by Lord Brahma and Lord Shiva and others saying that the sages and the devotees who have a bath in your waters would neutralize the sinful reactions of others who have deposited their sins in the waters. As a consequence, the waters basically would have potency. So the real effect of parikrama is to be with sadhus, because by coming in touch with sadhus, one becomes really purified. What is the potency of a sadhu? The sadhu can purify Mother Ganga, which is quite astonishing because she is considered to be the source of all purity. But at the same time, there's an exchange in Srimad Bhagavatam. We will look at it in the sixth canto, where her purification also depends on the sadhus. They neutralize the sinful reactions of those who have a bath, who are just, leading very mundane lives. Thereafter, he passed through very wealthy provinces like Surat, Savira, and Matsya, and through western India known as Kuru Jangala. At last, he reached the bank of the Yamuna, where he happened to meet Uddhava, the great devotee of Lord Krishna. Then, due to his great love and feeling, Vidura embraced him, Uddhava, who was a constant companion of Lord Krishna and formerly a great student of Brahaspati's. Vidura then asked him for news of the family of Lord Krishna, the personality of Godhead. We'll stop here for today. We want to talk a little bit about Sri Vidura, and this exchange is just phenomenal. What follows in the third canto is just phenomenal, and we'll talk about it. We'll also talk about the qualities of Sri Uddhava, and we will continue this further in the subsequent week. So I'll stop here. If there are any questions, I have around 20 minutes. At 6:30, I have to leave. So if I can take questions up to 6:30. So I have 20 minutes if you have questions.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, very nice class. Questions. I have one about where you spoke about Mother Sita being disrespected by Ravana, and so did Draupadi, disrobed. And where I see there's a contradiction here is women are to be protected, they are vulnerable, and yet they seem to be powerful that they can destroy a whole nation, and disempower their sukriti to even live long, just being offended. So in one sense they are weak, and then the other sense they are powerful. And also, if you could talk a little bit about this Navratri last week, that was about Mother Durga. And again, she's been empowered by all of the demigods to fight against a demon. I don't know. Could you talk a little bit about this, Prabhu?
I'll see. To the extent to which it will fall in context, I'll share a few things.
Yeah.
Sure. You see, the point being mentioned is that it is not so much the gender, it has more to do with dharma. So, Shastra is very clear in terms of saying that women, children, and older people have to be protected for prosperity, and brahmanas, of course. And as a consequence, Krishna basically resides there, and he is able to, the devotees, there's a presence of Krishna felt in places where this is done nicely in line with Shastra. So this is the Shastric principle, and this is dharma. So it has nothing to do specifically with someone not being able to protect themselves, but then they become powerful. Now, when do they become powerful? When do they become powerful is because we understand that power can come in different ways. They become very powerful if they are pure. Because they are so pure, they have the ability to carry great potency, and that great potency to punish also comes because of that power. You see? So that's where it is. They have great purity, and purity basically is power. And when that purity is violated, someone of such an exalted nature is violated, then that person has the ability to punish, basically, his great power. Now, you notice this, for example, with Jaya and Vijaya, the two gods of Lord Vishnu in Vaikuntha. Because they were Vaikuntha Vasis and they were basically Vaikuntha people, when they become demons, there is great destruction where Krishna himself has to descend to deal with them, because there's such great power.
Mm.
When it transforms itself into a different potency, then you need, it can become very destructive. So we also have, for example, we speak and we sometimes read about it in Bhagavatam. There is this whole concept of Brahma Rakshas, where someone is possessed by a Rakshasa who was a Brahmana in the previous existence, but who fell into misdeeds and as a consequence becomes and receives a Rakshasa body. When a Brahmana becomes a Rakshasa, it is very, very powerful. Not easy to deal with a Brahmana becoming a Rakshasa. You can deal with a Shudra becoming, a ghost. But when a Brahmana becomes a Brahma Rakshas, then it's very difficult to deal, because there's already a lot of potency that existed before. And because there was such potency that existed before, they have the ability to destroy as well. So these are two examples that you can take. Now, with Mother Draupadi, they were Shaktis themselves, Mother Draupadi and Mother Sita. They were Shaktis because it's such an extraordinary connection. Mother Draupadi was the wife of the five most powerful warriors, who are all, I would say, the purest form of the five different elements you can find. In the sense, we talk about Pancha Tattva of the earth element, the ethereal element, the air element, water element, etc. And each of the five Pandavas were absolutely 100% pure in one of those, to such an extent their potency was such that they were absolutely pure. These are great personalities. So when someone becomes a consort, she has great power. She is basically, Shiva herself was an empowered personality. She was extraordinarily chaste, because without being chaste, how do you handle five husbands? She was very chaste, extraordinarily chaste, and she was basically an extraordinarily powerful devotee of Krishna. So many different qualities came there with Mother Draupadi, that when that particular purity, that high principle gets violated, there's a great power of destruction that comes just on account of it. This is Shakti. Basically, it is the manifestation of Shakti, where there's great power that comes when there's such destruction. So Mother Sita is a similar example, where the anger of Lord Ram was fueled by her distress. So the power of her distress practically became the counterpart of the anger of Lord Sri Ram. So that was very destructive. So you can say that that is how these corresponding factors play into each other. So it is a principle that is being violated, not necessarily the gender in terms of someone being weak versus being strong. So I just wanted to clarify that first. And you asked about Navaratri, so I didn't understand the question though.
So again, it's the same. The Shero Ali Mata, she is the one who's now having all the demigods. I was just reading a little bit on her pastime and how she came about, and it seems like all the demigods gave some amount of shakti for her to come up to destroy a certain demon. And again,
Um,
I mean, just thinking again, why not why more? It seems like again Shakti personified is required to destroy somebody, and I can't understand. And part of me was like, surely the Lord has come many times to destroy. Narasimha Dev has come to destroy, and yet again Durga Devi is coming to destroy. So,
it is actually two different sides.
hmm,
Um, when I just spoke about it earlier, I said the 32 syllables of the Anushtuk mantra have the potencies of the different devas, and all those potencies are contained into that particular mantra, which is a personification of the Supreme Lord Narasimhadev. So he is the controller, the controlled are the devas, and when we chant the mantra, then the Lord benedicts us, because he's practically benedicting us through directly as well as through his servants, the devas, who are a part of the mantra. So, in that fashion, when someone is writing saying Mother Durga had to receive empowerment from the different devas, they're
yeah,
referring to a principle like the Anushtuk mantra, where she is basically created, she has all the principal powers when she's manifesting herself to wage war. That is the first point we want to make, is that it is not like they're contributing. It is already, she's a personification. She is the external energy of Krishna. So if there's the feminine or the external energy of Krishna is Mother Durga. So that is basically also how Krishna manages the material universe and controls all the devas, because all of them are under the control of Mother Durga and Lord Shiva. Yeah, they are the principal personalities. Now, what we need to understand is about the fact that um, sometimes we read about the Devi coming and killing, sometimes we read about the
yeah,
Lord coming and killing. So the point is that It's a perspective. So if you read from the perspective of whether it is the external energy, the separated energy of Krishna who did what she did, or do we read that the Shaktiman Krishna himself, practically empowered her and she carried out those acts? So we read it in different ways. There are those who are worshippers of Shakti who would prefer to see everything in a way where Shakti herself has caused and has created and has destroyed and manifested everything. And there are those like us who are basically following the Srimad Bhagavatam and the Vedas. And basically, we take up an understanding of both the internal energies, and the Supreme Lord who controls both. So I just wanted to distinguish the fact that it is not very different. It is the same, but it is being represented. Someone wants to read about the external energy alone. Someone wants to read about Krishna and his pastime. So these are two different versions. When you look at that version, it appears as if the external energy is doing everything without cause. In reality, when you understand it fully, external energy is a part of the Lord's potency. But when you want to read about her in detail, you get to read about how she came into being, and the different devas potencies also came there. Does it make sense? It is two different angles.
Yeah, and also who writes it and how they write it from their point of view as well.
That is true. Yes, there can always be some exaggeration. There can always be some truth which may not be what we would call as uh, very much aligned with and consistent with Shastra across the board.
Mm.
But the point being, what we are trying to say is understand, and we can break it down. There is the Adi Devik, Adi Bhautik, Adi Atmik. Adi Devik is controlled by the Supreme Lord. Now, when you say controlled by the Supreme Lord, does he come directly in touch? No. External energy, he comes in touch through the means of Lord Shiva. If the external energy were to be observed as a force on her own accord, then we look at it from the perspective of the worshippers of Shakti. Yeah. When we read Srimad Bhagavatam, we have this holistic understanding of Krishna being the origin of the external and the internal potency, and he interacts with devotees and the world in different ways. Yeah. So it's a different understanding. It's a different picture.
Yeah.
Same thing, different picture.
Yeah. Thank you, Prabhu. I have one more question. This is about envy and walking away from people who are envious. Totally agree. My question is sometimes we um, have to kind of have a point. So this is it. So coming back to even one more further, where you mentioned about Vaishnava Aparad, how much it destroys your sadhana and your cripples your spiritual life. If we take that one further, not just sadhakas, I think we should be careful with anybody, because again, Paramatma lives in within them, and Krishna's super soul is within them. So it's to as a blanket to be good to all of them. Now in such situations where somebody is envious, you walk away, fair enough, but at the same time, sometimes does it make that you make this aware? I mean, I can be more specific. In my work situation, I'm coming through something similar, and I walked away from that situation, but at the same time, for the for the other people, for sometimes it's good to tell somebody of authority that this is venomous and it is creating a certain, or is it that it's none of my business, I just walk away and I don't have to do with it, it's their karma and their life.
I think it's a matter of I think you have to be practical at the workplace, because most people don't have the ability to change their behavior because they don't do any sadhana. There is no sadhana, and as a consequence, they can't change anything about their lives, and they have to just go through what they're going through. Unless there is some level of sadhana at some level, then there is an opportunity for people to change the course of life and their future. So, in that sense, what I'm saying is, I think you ought to be more practical with the external world and how you want to deal with giving input, because it may not help and it
Hmm.
may help. It's a matter of practical judgment, but not participating in it, not allowing it to come into us, that's very important for us.
Absolutely. I agree totally with that. Where there is making an awareness, I'm also conscious of the fact that you are talking negative about somebody, and that might have its own repercussions. It's better to just keep quiet and walk away. And
Yes.
yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah. If it is in a spiritual environment where it is the temple, is it worthwhile to make this conversation with authority to say that this so and so is going through this anartha, this issue is creating ripples around? And is it worthwhile making the effort to go and make that known to somebody?
Um,
Authority?
yes, yes,
Yes.
always through proper channels. Yes.
Yes, of course, through channels. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you so much.
Hare, sure.
Bye.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna Prabhu, this is Hema Gopika Dasi. Please
Yes,
accept
Hare
my
Krishna.
humble Jai Shri
Hare.
Prabhupada. Prabhu, my doubt concerning Canto 2, Chapter 10, verse number 47. Sukadeva Goswami is saying in due course, I'll explain the measurement of time. And then, but for now, let me explain on to you the Padma Kalpa. But in 48th verse, Saunaka Rishi inquires from Suta Goswami about Vidura. So is this conversation again happening in further cantos, or it's just
No,
a suspicious topic?
the conversation about time does happen in the fifth canto. And
Okay, Prabhu.
yeah, and as far as the conversation about Vidura, we are doing it now in this particular.
Okay, but for the present, let me explain on to you the Padma Kalpa. I mean, this is the last statement of
I know.
47.
Yes.
So,
Go ahead, please.
So this kalpa, about this kalpa, I mean, there's a further conversation about this kalpa as well. And then
Yes.
further.
Yeah, it is in the fifth canto. We will be looking into it. We will talk about the kalpas and the manvantaras, etc.
Okay. Is there any specific reason that Saunaka Rishi has cut this conversation exactly at this point, Prabhu? I'm not.
Yes. No. It is his eagerness of wanting to talk about the exchange between devotees. So, in one sense, the active principle of transcendental knowledge is the exchange between devotees and their realizations. Shastra, in one sense, is passive. So you can keep a set of Srimad Bhagavatam at home and you may or may not read it. But then when you come in touch with devotees who are either living the principle or when they speak about it, that is basically even more powerful in causing transformation. So in that sense, sadhus always want to hear realizations, and he was wanting basically to hear the realizations he wanted to basically hear the conversation between Sri Vidura and Maitreya Rishi, which Sukadev Goswami had spoken to Parikshit Maharaj. He was eager to listen to that. That is the reason.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prabhu. I have one more question. Can I go ahead or should I
I don't see any other questions, so I can take one more question. Yes.
Okay, Prabhu. So what is the solution for if somebody is not accepting the authority, as you have discussed at the earlier of your session today? So if somebody is not accepting the authority and it is like their nature, birth nature. So how
Birth
should we
nature.
deal? Yeah. So
Okay.
how should we deal with such people?
They have to receive mercy. And the mercy that they have to receive can be in the form of Harinam and Prasadam. Invite them to a Sangha of devotees where there's Kirtan and give them Krishna Prasadam. This is how consciousness can change when someone is not willing to accept authority easily. So then they become more pliable.
Okay. Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Is there any other last question before I go? I have 2 minutes.
Prabhu, I have a question on Kartik. Would you guide us on to what is best in terms of what we can do during the month of Kartik to observe and to go deeper in our sadhana?
Well, you can set vratas, but I would say set Kartik vratas centered around improving japa. That if there is anything you should do, you should set vratas involving and surrounding improvements to japa, which essentially means observe and see and go back in our own lives as to when things worked out nicely for japa and try to increase more of that. That could be possibly, waking up at a certain time, planning for a japa session right in advance, and doing everything in advance. You see, basically what I'm saying is, uh, focus on japa from the previous day, the 2 days before, etc. So that's basically what I would recommend. I would say that would be the best thing for one to move forward during Kartik, because you can form habits, and then those habits themselves can be very powerfully taken forward in future days after Kartik as well. The more important thing is to go back and find out what worked, emulate it, and focus on japa, which essentially means that if you want to wake up and chant an X number of rounds, which is even more than what you normally do, then when do you go to bed, what do you eat, all of that has to be thought of on that basis. That's the point I'm trying to make. That's the only thing that I would advise, because that's the most powerful thing one can actually do during Kartik. I'm going to take a question from chat, and then I'm going to end the session because I have to go. There's someone who is saying, can you please give advice for a very beginner, someone who is beginning and who is in the very first stages? I can give you 3 pieces of advice. The first advice is, the first advice is on Sevon Mukehi Jihva Adav. Jihva is the tongue, and Seva is basically service. Seva Unmukha. If you want to basically start your service, start with your tongue. So what do? You first of all learn how to offer the food and everything else that you eat to Krishna, and then include prasadam as many times as possible during the day in your day-to-day activity. That's the first step one should take. Sevon Mukehi Jihvadav. The next step would be to at least start with taking one firm step of chanting at least 108 repetitions of the Mahamantra. Start with 108, which is one mala, and then once you find taste, you don't increase it until you really feel compelled to increase it to 2, do the same again, and whenever you increase, you never reduce it for the future. So a simple combination is trying to learn how to offer food that we cook. What are the ingredients we can add? What is it that Krishna likes? You could buy a cookbook. You could buy a book which is basically authored by devotees, and there are wonderful books that are very easy to follow. And you could start doing at least one dish a day or 2 dishes a day, and you could make that arrangement for offering it to Krishna. And then at least start by repeating Harinam 108 times, and don't stop, at least until you basically don't ever fall back on this. That's the first step. 2 steps. The third step is definitely go and visit the local ISKCON center. Find out where there is Sangha, because when you go to Sangha, a lot of wonderful things can happen. You can come in touch with devotees, you can be inspired by devotees, you can receive support, you can practically be guided. So I would advise you to do that as well. Okay, so thank you very much. So we'll end today, and um, we'll come back again in the following week, and then we will move forward. We'll basically continue with the third canto. Third canto is just, it's nectarian. There's very deep philosophy, but in a very simple language. So we'll meet again. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Happy Kartik.